every child in public school starting in kindergarten is going to have an investment account for their educational futures. And so we launched this project. We're finishing our 4th school year in Western Queens. So if anyone is in the neighborhoods of Astoria, Long Island City, Sunnyside, Woodside, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, or Corona, and you know or you have a kindergarten, first, second, or third grader in your life, and they go to public school, they likely, 95% of every one of the K, first, second, and third graders right now in these communities has a scholarship account for their higher education. And to date, they have accumulated about $6 million, which we are really, really excited about. And so actually one sort of timely piece of information is last week on Thursday, the mayor announced as part of his Juneteenth economic recovery, economic justice initiative that we will be expanding the NYC Kids Rise Safer College program to every single kindergartner in New York City starting in September. And so we're really excited about that. And so in terms of the kind of impetus, I'll move to the pandemic in a moment, but in terms of sort of the impetus behind this, this work is really about really equity and inclusion at its core. It's how do we, in one of the richest cities in the world, how do we make sure that every single child, every single community has access to really economic opportunity. And so we have really set this up, as I sort of just described, as a public-private community partnership. Research suggests that, students or young children that have even a small dollar account are 3 times more likely to go to college and significantly more likely to graduate. It doesn't take, anyone involved who has been through education in the Stern community will understand how expensive higher education is at all costs. And really sort of at its core of this work, we are really working to try to tackle the racial wealth gap and figure out how, as really a city and a network, can we get as much money as possible into the accounts of families and communities who have historically been excluded. And so one might imagine when you think about the pandemic, which again, as I'm sure you all know and maybe have felt personally, I hope not, has really been economically devastating, economic devastating, health devastating. I mean, there's so many repercussions of what has happened that Laura touched on some of them. And so I can get more into that and talk about sort of how our operation has shifted there. But really what sort of showed up the most in this work is that we are very focused on the future, thinking about what's possible. And of course, the last year and a half has had to focus on the urgent emergency situations. But the reality is, when you look at sort of the devastation of the pandemic, it was unequally impacted across different communities. If you walk in the neighborhoods that, I live in, that the families that, the Safer College program touches, food pantry lines are down the block. I mean, it is unconscionable to think about what families and folks, emergency workers, what people had to go through. And so when we think about the Safer College program and what we are working to build, I call a decentralized economic platform. We are working to really think about systemic change and building different structures and institutions so that, the next time something egregious like this occurs, that communities won't be so disproportionately impacted as we have seen here.
Great. Okay, thank you, Debra-Ellen. Mac, you fill out the intro.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, so I work in city government at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which manages a number of economic initiatives on behalf of the city. And then within the NYC EDC, I manage a nonprofit corporation, an affiliate of EDC, which provides tax credit financing for community development projects in low-income neighborhoods. So these are specifically healthcare centers, community facilities, and supermarkets in neighborhoods across the city. In terms of EDC during the pandemic, EDC really played a key part in supporting the overall city's public health response to the pandemic. First through procurement of PPE and equipment for hospitals, and then through testing. The EDC helped establish one of the larger COVID testing sites at the Alexandria Center on 30th Street up by Bellevue. And then through supporting vaccinations the EDC helps support the overall vaccination effort, including offering vaccinations at some EDC sites, such as the Brooklyn Army Terminal in Sunset Park. In terms of my specific role, one thing that we've focused on with my program during the pandemic is really trying to dedicate more resources to healthcare. So specifically, we recently funded 2 healthcare clinics, one in East New York and then another one in Jamaica, Queens, which will each serve about 10,000 people, primarily low-income residents of those communities. And then we're also working with St. John's Episcopal Hospital to implement a women's clinic in a project we helped fund in the Rockaways. And in addition, something really I find interesting is we launched an RFP to solicit ideas for more innovative healthcare models and models of delivering healthcare, new models of delivering healthcare in low-income neighborhoods and low-income communities, where we know there are a lot of longstanding healthcare inequities and healthcare disparities. So we received some really interesting proposals from healthcare organizations across the city for those projects, with really interesting new ideas in terms of providing direct outreach, technology, ideas that focus on nutrition and other areas. And we'll likely make some awards over the next 6 months or so to try to test out and implement some of those new models of healthcare delivery.
Okay, thank you, Mac. So, I have a sense. I think we've gotten a sense of where the three of you are and what's been happening. Since a major focus for today's session should be the economic recovery, we see all around. You just have to go out on the street. There are more vehicles on the street, more people on the sidewalks, etc. But still, the numbers say this has been a slow, sluggish recovery. The unemployment rate in New York City is a little bit north of 10%. That's double the national rate. How do you see the recovery unfolding, and how do you see it both affecting your particular organizations and the role your organization will play in that recovery? Debra-Ellen, let me start with you on this time around, and we'll shake it, mix it up a little bit.
All right. So it's really interesting hearing that number. So, I think in sort of the space that I've been living in and the work that we have been doing, the kind of the implications of the pandemic. I mentioned the food pantry lines. I mentioned the loss of employment, the trauma of so many people losing loved ones. I didn't mention the transition to remote schooling, and then the transition to not to remote schooling. And I think the light that shined on childcare overall, and that sort of sector, and the need for sort of that, both from a government response as well as in the private sector. So I guess just to sort of name those things in terms of, Larry, tell me the question again, exactly what I should answer.
Well, it's, we've got a somewhat slow, the economy is recovering, no question about that. But at least as compared with the national level, things are sluggish. How do you see it from the perspective of your organization?
Okay. So sort of where I'm sitting, to me, this is the opportunity, and this is almost cliche at this point, but what is the new normal we're envisioning? What is the new type of economic structures that we need to put in place and support from from all these different sectors? And I think, Mac, really interested to hear sort of about your financing and your work. I think that is very, very relevant to all of this. And of course, Laura, your work in the total job creation space. From sort of my vantage point, and in a former life, I ran the city's Office of Financial Empowerment. I think that there's questions that I ask all the time is, how do we expand ownership, right? How do we expand that every people have sort of equity stakes and investment in their businesses, in institutions. And so I'm, a part of, again, with what NYC Kids Rise has done is we have worked to create basically universal access to mainstream financial services and access and democratized capital markets. So now you have 13,000 families in, one of the most diverse school districts in the country. Every single one of those families is now connected to capital markets, a 529 account. Okay, what does that mean for thinking about how do you actually build? When I talk about ownership, I'm talking about how do you actually build real assets and build real wealth. And now I'm not just talking about sort of getting a job that pays a minimum wage where you actually can't accumulate over time. And again, this also ties to how do you think about intergenerational wealth building and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'll add.
Mac, how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, well, this is such a good question, and so many obviously facets of this. In my mind, as I think about it, there are about, I think, around 8 million people in New York City in the 5 boroughs. And I believe about 4.2 million of them were in the workforce pre-pandemic. And then I think over the pandemic, we lost about 1 million jobs due to closures of businesses, lost small businesses, retail establishments, lost service sector workers. There's obviously a huge job loss very quickly. And then we've seen a rebound. I think we're at about 500,000 of those jobs that have come back. So I think, in my mind, just thinking about the economic recovery, obviously the first priority has been to address the ongoing pandemic. It's a public health crisis. We needed to address that. Second, we need to start thinking about basic social services and functions for people across the city in all neighborhoods, including housing, clean water, food security, sanitation, public safety, transportation, obviously very important. And so, third, I think we need to think about how to bring the labor market back to its pre-pandemic levels, obviously with a focus on equity and inclusion. And so, I think there's sort of 3 things that I think about in that context. One is the creation of better quality jobs. And these are areas such as tech, the life sciences, and clean energy. As a corollary to that, there's a workforce development training that can provide a pathways to those jobs for people that might not be able to access them typically. And then I think the third is just affordable housing. I think that's so important. So I think this is one of the biggest issues. So I would just sort of flag those 3 things, creation of new quality jobs in specific sectors, workforce development training, and then affordable housing as being sort of like 3 pillars of economic recovery that can be inclusive for people.
As my grandmother, probably on both sides, would have said, from your lips to God's ear, in terms of getting the jobs, getting the training, getting the housing. We will, I hope, come back to that. Laura, how do you see things?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with this discussion. As context, one of the reasons why I went to NYU for my MBA is because they were the only MBA program that I knew of that had an urbanization project in the business school. So specifically thinking about economics of cities, business of cities, things like that. One of the hopefully lifelong mentors I developed there was someone named Milan Berteau, who urban planner, urban economist, who thinks a lot about cities. And post MBA nights and weekends while I was working for BCG, I edited his book called Order Without Design, which thinks a lot about economic forces in cities, and specifically grassroots based rather than kind of top-down planning based. And one of his principles, which I agree with, and I think I've heard as a tenor across this group, is cities are essentially labor markets, right? So what are the ways that we can, outside of all the great placemaking and what does this neighborhood feel like and all these other components, people come to cities to find, great jobs for themselves, livelihood for their family, allows them to save for a future, right? Whether that's college or something else. And so as part of that equation, I think a lot of elements have been brought up here about what's really essential to, house people in that labor market, educate people in that kind of market. And then transportation, equity in a city can oftentimes be defined by what percentage of jobs do you have access to across the city, because that increases your economic potential as an individual to get the best option for yourself, right? And some of those higher quality jobs that Mac's speaking to. And so I think, something that's very top of mind for me, and I have a lot of concerns about, is people are still, when you look at the numbers, concerned about taking the subway. And unfortunately, that means that many people are opting for individual personal vehicles as well as bikes, which I can speak to. We know pre-pandemic that New York City was losing about $34 billion a year to lost economic output due to congestion alone of people in individual vehicles, like lost wages, lost time. And we know that greenhouse gas emissions from transportation as a sector is only increasing, versus we've started to solve it on the building side in terms of thinking through better building management systems. And so to me, when I think about, what's necessary coming out of these moments, I think that, we've done some work in New York City, and then there are some cities internationally who are really paving the way for this, is thinking about how do we fundamentally reallocate space to more efficient uses, effective solutions, and less, more sustainable solutions on our streets. In New York City today, space for bike lanes is less than 1% of total street space allocation. It's something like 0.94%. Car-free bus lanes are something like 0.02%. And space for vehicles is something like 74%, and sidewalks occupy the rest. And so what are ways that we are essentially holding ourselves back from having kind of better access to job markets, labor markets, things like that, is something that I think about a lot and is certainly critical to the work that we're doing at Citi Bike. We have both, not only in kind of volume of rides that we're doing, we have invested heavily, and this is part of kind of Lyft's acquisition of Citi Bike and a host of other brands. In 2018, we have an investment of $100 million in New York City alone to double the size of the Citi Bike service area. So this year, that included more of the Bronx, Sunset Park, parts of Queens, and we're continuing to expand that service area. And I think what's really critical to that is that we're going to many aspects of and parts of the city that have been traditional transit deserts, where transit infrastructure was not built due to a bunch of wrongful moments in urban history. Bus service is oftentimes not provided given density that doesn't work, given kind of built environment challenges. And so we think a lot about what does first last mile transportation look like to ensure that people have great, safe, easy, reliable solution to get to and from work.
Okay. As all of you know, as I think all of our audience knows, just yesterday was primary election day. We may not know most of the results for a while, and we don't have the final election until November. It was just a primary. Although, anyway, if you were, going to write a memo, a proposal for the mayor, whoever he or she may turn out to be, coming into office, shortly after November, given, we would all, like, lots of things to be done, but there are realistic limitations on funding. What is the state prepared to do? What is the federal government prepared to do? So within those sort of realistic boundaries, if you were thinking about writing a memo for the incoming mayor shortly after the November election, focusing on the economic recovery and focusing on, the emphasis on greater inclusion. What would be the major points that you would want to be in that memo? Again, keeping within realistic boundaries. Now, Mac, I'm going to start with you. You're already, in a sense, part of city government, but still, that gives you an interesting perspective. What is your memo? What does your memo look like for the incoming mayor?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Having written several memos kind of like this, maybe not for the mayor, but for others, I'm sort of gears are starting to turn in my head. I think that, one thing to focus on is that it's the private sector, that is hiring people in terms of like the labor market. And I think that we've seen like a real impetus and push from a lot of private sector employers to try to incorporate more equitable hiring practices and inclusionary practices into their hiring. So I think that I might stress that, like, I think that that's important, and it's important to set a tone to keep encouraging the private sector to do that. I think I would also highlight that there are several existing government programs that have been successful in terms of promoting equity and inclusion into the New York City economy. One of those is the MWBE program, which is a program that encourages the participation of minority and women-owned businesses in city contracting. So when the city is building large real estate projects, these developers are incorporating goals to incorporate MWBE firms into those contracts.
Mac, can you tell us what the initials stand for?
Sure. Yeah. MWBE stands for Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises, which are typically these firms that are owned by minorities or women have not always received these city contracts to build for construction projects. That's a key program that I think is really helping to encourage more equitable process in the city's contracting process. There's also the Hire NYC program, in which any project that receives city financial assistance typically can work with local business hiring centers. They're operated by the Small Business Services Department. So that's a pipeline to try to bring local hiring into businesses that are somehow receiving city assistance. And then there are also living wage and prevailing wage requirements as well for many businesses that are doing business with the city. So I think that I would just flag that there are important programs that the city is trying to implement in partnership with the private sector that are currently helping to advance equity and inclusion in the workforce. And so I think my memo would highlight those as well, just to say we should keep sustaining those and build them.
Okay. Laura, what does your memo look like?
I think there's two aspects on the memo, both of which are a little bit radical, require not so much money, but maybe a lot of political will, which can sometimes be just as difficult. I think, as I referenced earlier, I would want to radically reallocate space on streets to methods of transportation that are mass. So be that car-free bus lanes, bike lanes, others, new mobility lanes as we think about future of delivery in New York City, right? I think delivery pre-pandemic was already increasing. I think during the pandemic, went up about 2x in terms of amount of delivery coming into New York City. How do we best manage that? I think that requires a redistribution of streets towards other modes of transportation. I think it requires charging for parking. New York City has 3 million free parking spaces across the city, a huge lost economic opportunity. Back of envelope math for me is, if of those 3 million free parking spaces, we deem 50% of them to be close enough to public transit and other forms of transportation, right, that someone could have a good alternative kind of mode. And then we say that 50% of them might be occupied, and maybe we charge $1 an hour. Very simple math gets you to $7 billion a year in terms of economic output to the city in terms of revenue. That's real money.
That's real money.
That's real money that can pay for a lot, right? And if you think about, more layered analysis, which anyone doing a bottom-up analysis would do, and say commercial would pay more and all these other things, you get probably double that. And so I just think about the real benefit that we could bring to New Yorkers by making steps that have been felt obvious for a long time, right? And, would create more equity in transportation networks, and you could allocate that to housing. Like there's so many great education, there's so many great use cases and, parts of the city that need it. So I would say like, that's very top of mind for me. So how do we allocate space? And then how do we charge for space effectively? Again, streets are 25% of space in the city. It's very sizable, and we're not using it effectively or thoughtfully. And then,
sorry, go. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and secondly, I do think that we have created over time a number of unnecessary regulations in the city as it relates to housing and as it relates to like size of housing. And we've created a severe, as we've talked about before, affordability crisis where we can't solve for even middle-class housing in New York City at the moment, much less like lower income housing. And that solve for middle income, part of lower income is like allowing for there to be more supply in the market, right? When you think about supply and demand, the demand in New York City so far outstrips supply. So I think I would also want to think about rezoning larger parts of the city. I think we've all seen what that's looked like as it's played out in Soho, right? An area that has needed rezoning for a long time. Average, wealth income profile is quite high, but I think that that's necessary across great parts of the city if we're to think about how we bring in and house more and more people.
Okay. I take it from both what you said before and what you just said, you are looking forward to the implementation of the congestion, however that congestion fee is going to end up looking, the congestion fee for Lower Manhattan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, average traffic speeds in Lower Manhattan are something like 5 miles per hour right now. So when you then tie that back to $34 billion in lost economic output to New York City as a result of congestion, whatever people would be paying as part of congestion would probably be too low, right? Because we know that we would never actually charge like the actual rate. There have been studies all around the world actually that have shown, people would pay to reduce congestion and pay to reduce traffic. I think in Germany, it was something like $1,200 a year to reduce, traffic by 30%, which is actually not rational. You should actually be paying a lot more based on all those lost dollars to you. And so when we think about how do we make the city function better for an average resident, how do we invest back into public transportation that is the most effective way to move people across streets and bike lanes, right? Everything basically moves more effectively than a car. And so I cannot myself get excited about EVs and autonomous in New York City. I can get excited about how do we move more and more people to better forms of transportation.
Gotcha. All right. Debra-Ellen, you've had lots of opportunity to think about your memo here. Tell us your version of the memo.
Well, I was listening, so I wasn't necessarily thinking, but I will share that I'm not going to choose this as my memo right now, but to mention the state of the New York City Housing Authority and public housing in New York City, which is ground zero for really the fight around income inequality. And if you really talk about inclusive economic growth, you have to care about the conditions that it is crumbling, and it is a stain on all of us, the conditions that so many people have to live in. That is both a federal, state, and local issue, so I'm not going to choose this to be my memo, but I do want to sort of call that out right now. And it is related to what I'm about to say. In terms of my memo, just sort of what I talked about before, right? Black and Hispanic families own less than 10% and 12% of the wealth of white families, respectively. And it is my belief that in an economy that works for all of us, that there is opportunity to build real financial assets across generations, so that really people have options and that really can accumulate and have different, have choices really. And so, and that is both on an individual and a community level. And so where my memo would really be focused, and that's why I spend my my life doing what I'm doing is, and I'm very lucky to have that privilege and that choice, is really to figure out, now that the Safer College program, and the term college almost is a little bit confusing, maybe in the future we're going to change the name of it, but really the Safer College program is going to be citywide, which means that really there's this, I like to call it a decentralized economic platform, right? That so now ultimately next year, all kindergarten families, but ultimately all public school families will be connected to, a mainstream financial product. How can we think about what that offers? I should say this. What it really is there's an opportunity for families to save money for their educational futures. It could be vocational for college, but you'll have a resource for when you graduate high school. So you can save your own money. Then there's initial money that NYC Kids Rise, which is my organization, what we will put in. So there's, it's up to $200 there. And then there's this opportunity for community, or for, let's just say Lyft, or let's just say the city, to add more additional resources into these accounts. We have seen examples of that in the pilot program that we have done. We have examples where the Astoria Houses Resident Association President Claudia Koga raised $1,000 for every child that lives in Astoria houses. So now in Astoria houses, which the average income is probably around $22,000 a year for families. So many folks may not even have $200 in $500 in emergency savings. Families have kindergartners, first, second, and third graders have $1,500 already, and that they know that they have something. And so, to the next mayor, what I would say, how can we use the power of the public, private, and community to continue to drive resources into these accounts, which, I believe would have tremendous impact, both on an individual level, but not really on the community level, around building and accumulating assets, but also really around expectations about what's possible from a very young age, again, both local, but individually and community-wide.
Great. All right. I think we've reached the point. I really appreciate hearing, and I'm sure our audience has appreciated hearing your views on these. We do have some questions from the audience. So I'll just start, and whoever would like to address it, I think many of them, can be addressed by all three of you. Here's one. What do you think about decreased safety in New York City, and what your organizations are doing to address that, especially in underserved areas? Safety, underserved areas, your organizations. Who would like to take the first crack at this?
Well, I would just comment that I guess I am probably not the best person to weigh in on public safety and the status across NYC neighborhoods, but just a general statement, I think from an economic growth and stability perspective, it's very important that our neighborhoods are safe, and that people are able to be comfortable in their neighborhoods. So I just think it's an important baseline that we should pay attention to.
Okay. Anything, Laura, Debra-Ellen, you'd like to add? Let's take Citi Bikes. The issue of safety, underserved neighborhoods. How does your organization think about those things?
I guess we think about safety less from a crime perspective in some ways, which is why I was hesitating to answer as well. I think we think about how do we provide the best product to folks across the city so that they have a safe and consistent riding experience, and make sure that they're receiving the education that they need to do that. So we have safety training videos, safety materials, we have safety decals in the baskets of all of our bikes, helping you understand how to ride, appropriate ways to do so. Because I think, we want to encourage everyone to be able to take a bike ride for the first time and feel like that freeing experience, add an alternative mode of transportation to your arsenal. But we want to ensure that they're safe while doing that. We, in particular, do kind of those kinds of hands-on safety training classes in many of the underserved neighborhoods in which we work and operate, we do a series of community grant programs with local community-based organizations, fund kind of reduced bike share programs that facilitate anyone who lives in NYCHA housing or receives SNAP benefits to receive a hugely discounted memberships of $5 a month to Citi Bike, and provide mechanisms for access, and then want to ensure kind of comfortability and then feelings of safety while riding. I think in terms of commentary on overall safety of New York City, I agree with Mac that it's a problem to be solved. I do think that it's been it has felt hyperbolized in the media in terms of like the rise of unsafe events in total when you actually look at the data over time. So I think that we're now back to a state that's similar to the beginning of de Blasio's period in office. So end of the Bloomberg era. So the amount of change is not as, I think, aggressive as I think many people would want us to believe.
Debra-Ellen?
I mean, I think others have covered it. I don't have to chime in.
Okay. That question made me reflect. In your memos to the mayor, none of you mentioned safety as one of, didn't get into the first two bullet points or so that, the pure economic stuff dominated the safety ideas in all of your memos.
Yeah, I do think although it didn't come up in this discussion and maybe we're focused more on the economic side, the election was just held last night, and Eric Adams, who ran as on safety and history of being kind of, a police officer and things like that, right, is currently the top candidate. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do on some of the ranked choice things, but I think that that's indicative of a tenor across the city on these issues.
All right, here's another question and by the way, let me encourage the audience, we do have the open Q&A possibility, to type something into the Q&A box. So please do avail yourselves of this. Here's another question. What are some changes that occurred during the pandemic that you think are here to stay? And by changes, I think we could be broad changes within your organization, as well as changes in the larger environment in the city. So what changes occurred during the pandemic that you think are here to stay?
I can chime into that one. Yeah. I think that one of the things that we've seen across the city is, or at least has gotten more attention, is the rise of more formal mutual aid networks, or the rise of sort of this idea also of really like local activities and like local support systems and communities coming together in a kind of different way, at least in a way that had not previously gotten that same level of attention. It may have been happening in many different types of communities and more under the radar of mainstream media, say. But I think that I'm not sure if that attention is here to stay. And it's again, none of this is necessarily new. It's just so people are looking for it, maybe looking at it. And maybe it also suggested some levels of government failure at the time, which is why that was coming about. But that, I think that what is so important to recovery and to inclusive recovery and to really, stability of community is really community coming together and like social infrastructure within neighborhoods and really capacity of within neighborhoods. And so in so much as, and I saw that firsthand, so many times over in, when you're looking for where is the leadership, well, the leadership is right there and it's networked across the street from you in this school, in this business near this hospital. And so I think that there's a question, can government, can other sort of leadership really work to continue to foster these networks and the capacity within community? And that is really something that social resiliency is really essential for any sort of long-term economic, especially equitable economic growth.
Okay, any?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll keep my transportation and streets hat on and just talk about something that we've probably all appreciated, which is open restaurants. Open restaurants seemed so controversial at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was an amazing moment to put forward something that did require a lot of political will, was really accepted at the time. And when you look at it, I think open restaurants have taken about 8,500 of those parking spaces across the city, which is a total of 0.2% of parking, and created 100,000 jobs. And I think those are just the kinds of stats that honestly get me excited when we think about New York as a space constraints place. How do we better reallocate space to support job growth, to support people doing things outside, connecting with others in ways that are unique and remarkable? Social cohesion as a measure of like neighborhood resilience, connectivity, people vote more, right? Like all of the things that Debra-Ellen was just like mentioning in terms of like the leader across the street. Like there are just so many other uses that we can imagine when it comes to uses of space. And so I think open restaurants, open streets, more uses like that, I think are things that really excite me and I can see continuing.
Great. Matt?
I just wanted to add one thought, and that is the life sciences industry, I think, is here to stay. At least the EDC over the past decade really has been working on a major effort to invest in life science companies, wet lab space, and innovations in this industry. And I think with the pandemic, there's been a renewed realization that this is really important work, not only from a job creation perspective, but also from a public health outcomes perspective too. So I think that there will be continued investment in life sciences, and we'll see New York City start to really compete with Boston and the Bay Area in terms of life science innovation.
Okay, that's a great hopeful statement. This, asking you to sort of think even larger. How can we as New Yorkers make a difference in ensuring inclusion if we don't work at organizations like yours? What can the, all right, well, what can we as New Yorkers make a difference? How can we as New Yorkers make a difference? So anybody have any suggestions? Mark?
I'll just start with one quick one, which is like, I think one of the things we've been talking about is like local activism, right? And thinking about what that means. So doing things like showing up to your local community board or taking a position on your local community board, housing decisions, transportation decisions, like inclusivity decisions, oftentimes based on the way the government is structured, go through local community boards, and they're actually an incredibly powerful institution in many neighborhoods. So thinking on that side, thinking about what are issues that you care about and what are ways to make your voice heard to local electeds. They actually really care when they hear from residents, especially repeatedly hear from residents. And I think thinking about what are things that you actually want to dedicate your time to, and some of those straightforward ways to me feel very top of mind.
Okay.
I think also one thing that I've really seen throughout the pandemic is the importance of nonprofits. I feel like there's so many good nonprofits out there. They're doing incredible work across the city. And they're a really important part of our society and also economy too, from a perspective of equity and inclusion. And so I think that to the extent I agree with Laura, it's important to get into the grassroots political process. And to echo Debra-Ellen's point, like I think community-based planning and organization is really, really important. And I would just also throw out nonprofits. Like there are a lot of great community-based nonprofits that are doing great work. So I think it's important to support them.
Okay. Debra-Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just assuming if you're on this, lunch meeting or whatever, there's probably, and if you're part of the STIR community, you have really strong technical skills that can be really of use to different types of organizations, civic associations. And so just to echo what, Max said, and that the best advice I ever got a million years ago that has stuck with me is find a neighborhood and plant your feet there. and because I happen to think neighborhoods will impact everything. And so I try to pass on that piece of wisdom as well.
As I was thinking about this, one, and I think it is a part of everything that the three of you said. Think community, be community minded, and that can address joining local organizations, thinking about nonprofits. Focusing on the neighborhood, even doing little things like, make sure you're not adding to litter on the streets, and maybe even, picking up the occasional stray piece of litter and putting it in the local trash barrel. It's community mindedness. Who knows? It might even serve as a role model for your kids, for your neighbors, etc. All right, we're getting close to the 1 o'clock point, which is a ending point. Would any of you like to offer any final words before we turn it back to Callie?
So thank you for having us and bringing us together. I loved hearing Debra-Ellen and Mac's points too across education, housing, jobs. Always great to see you, Larry. So thank you.
Okay.
Likewise. I would just add that it's really nice to be part of a network like that, and to connect with others that obviously have a lot of really interesting ideas and expertise. And this panel has been great. I would welcome the opportunity to do that with more folks who may be listening to this call as well in the future. So I just thank NYU for that opportunity and look forward to continued conversations as well.
Debra-Ellen?
Yeah, you made me think of so much about economic opportunity and mobility is about social networks, and we've talked about this. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this one. And just the more that we can, one thing that I think is to the other point of the other question, when you say, what can you do about equity and inclusion? It's how are you leveraging your own social network, if it is robust, and how you're building it to support other folks who may not have access to that is something I think it's good to think about. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this one.
Great. Well, I want to thank all three of you. I hope the audience, we can't see or hear them, but I want to offer my thanks. And Dean Raghu Sundaram, very busy man. I hope he will have an opportunity to see the video recording of this. Because, man, if he does, I'm sure he will say, these are 3 Stern MBA graduates. It brings joy to my heart to see and hear them say what they did. I really appreciate, on Dean Sundaram's behalf, let me say, this has been a really interesting and really, I think, fruitful conversation. I really thank all 3 of you. So, Callie, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. And I echo that as well. This has been such a great conversation. So on behalf of Stern as well and NYU, I want to thank you all, Larry, Laura, Debra-Ellen, and Mac, for taking the time to share your perspectives with us. And to all of our alumni in the audience, we hope you all enjoyed our Bringing Back NYC Inclusive Economic Recovery panel discussion. This has been the 4th and final installment of our Bringing Back NYC event series. So please check out the NYU Stern video library for recordings of past events. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, guys. Thank you.